Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for our next session here on the Network Advantage AMRC. Our webinar today, Capitol Hill Forecast, what should MCRCs prepare for? As you all know, there's a lot going on out there. We've got two really good folks with us to talk about it, Patrick Cooney and Jim Cremidas, and I'll tell you more about them in just a second. Neither really needs any introduction, but they're going to get one anyway. But in the meantime, I want to remind everybody that we have a polling question out there. Please answer that. We're trying to get a sense of your priorities and how things are impacting you out there in the field. We also encourage, we're going to have a pretty full hour today to talk about several topics. I'll go over those in just a second, but we're encouraging you to ask questions or chime in with comments or things you want us to follow up on. Any thoughts you have, we welcome them. So please don't hesitate. Don't wait till the end. Do it from the very beginning or as something comes up, as you're prompted or something. If you have your own experiences you'd like us to add in, we'll keep it anonymous, but we'd love to get your thoughts on how things are impacting you out there, what you're concerned about, what you're seeing, what you're hearing. But with that, let me jump in. I'm going to introduce Patrick and Jim, and then we'll jump right into this. Patrick Cooney established the Federal Group in 1999 to provide high-quality government relations consulting services to companies, associations, municipalities, and nonprofit organizations. Over the past 25 years, the Federal Group has represented the interests of over 50 health-related organizations. Prior to starting the firm, Patrick lobbied on behalf of the American Physical Therapy Association and the American Society for Clinical Laboratory Science. He's also got extensive experience on Capitol Hill. We're going to benefit from that today as well. Jim Cremidas needs no introduction. He's our executive director here at AMRC. Previously, he was the executive director at the Association of Clinical Research Professionals. He's got an extensive background in the CRO area, also with Eli Lilly, and we are really honored to have both with us today. Patrick, I think we're going to have a very free-flowing, interactive conversation. Patrick's going to be focusing really on Capitol Hill and what's going on. I think Jim's going to focus a little more on impact on industry and sort of the industry point of view on what's going on. With that, let me start with you, Patrick, and just ask you if you could give us an overview. What the heck's going on out there?
Well, first of all, great question. Thank you for the invite and for the kind introduction, Michael and Jim. It's great to be with you again. Yeah, there's a lot going on. The one thing I would say, one thing I've learned over my 25 years of running my own firm and working on Capitol Hill and being involved here in DC is that change is the order of the day. Every couple of years, we have a new administration, we have a new Congress. Oftentimes, it's a new political party that's taking the lead. And it really is amazing. If you look over the last 30 years, how many changes in political leadership we've had. And the thing that I would say is that I know further change is coming. It's the one thing that's constant here in DC. And so we're seeing that now. Obviously the elections, have an outcome and an impact, and we're starting to see that play out throughout DC. And I'll talk a little bit about sort of some of the changing faces and because I think the leadership is really important, and then some of the changing ideologies and how that impacts healthcare, politically, particularly clinical research. And then I think we'll get into some of the areas about funding and crystal ball. So we're really just in the beginning stages here. We're in Q1 of 2025, but we're really only 2 months into the new administration. Lots of activity, trying with the president issuing executive orders. We're going to talk a little bit about those and how to really see those. But lots of changes in faces. So, all the Biden administration officials have been moved out, the politicals. A lot of the career people are still in place, but we're getting the new political staff in place. And so, the primary one that folks have been talking about is obviously the new Secretary of Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who was confirmed by the Senate back on February 13th, so just about a month ago. So everything is very new here. But he was confirmed by a slim majority, 52 to 48. And we know that, he said some has made some statements that have certainly raised eyebrows relating to vaccines and public health initiatives. So what have we seen him do in the first month on the job? Well, he made good on his commitment to address food safety regulations. So we've already seen the FDA is starting to do some rulemaking with regard to food safety and food additives and ingredients. But on the healthcare, more on the traditional healthcare side, we've seen that they've announced a public health emergency declaration with respect to the opioid crisis. That had been a focus area in the previous Trump administration, certainly in the Biden administration as well. But I think it's going to get renewed emphasis in the second Trump administration. A couple of other things we've seen just out of the gates from the new secretary is the closure of some offices. The Office of Long COVID Research and Practice was closed. And then we've seen some changes already to the Office of Pandemic Preparedness and Response Policy at the White House. Now, we're going to see other very significant changes, I'm certain, to the way these agencies appear. I'm sure you've all followed the news with respect to the Department of Education and possible closure. We're going to get into some of that. There is a healthy debate going on here about who has the authority to make these changes. Certainly, the administration has some authority, but a lot of this authority rests with Congress. But one other, I think, area of emphasis that we've certainly seen right out of the gate from HHS is focus on or focus away from diversity, equity, and inclusion, the DEI efforts, and then also gender identity. And so we've already seen some defunding of initiatives in those areas. The next thing to watch for as far as leadership is certainly NIH director and the FDA commissioner. So you may have seen that just yesterday, the Senate confirmed both Dr. Bhattacharya to be director of NIH and also Dr. McCary to be the new FDA commissioner. Very much on party line votes, but both sailed through their confirmation hearings, pretty easily. Dr. Bhattacharya, there were a number of issues that came up at his hearings, particularly focused on, some of the actions that the Trump administration made right out of the gate with respect to NIH administrative cost funding, reducing the cap on administrative funding to 15%. And Dr. Bhattacharya has indicated that, he would follow the law. So he would work with Congress to address that. And he's made similar statements with respect to staffing at NIH, that it is his intent to make a review of NIH and the staffing needs. And it is interesting that even though there were some initial cuts of staff, I'm certain you're aware of, several thousand staff were let go, mostly probationary staff from NIH and then from really every sector of the federal government. But it is noteworthy that those are under legal review. Actually, there have been several actions by federal district courts, and we're awaiting more actions by appellate courts and then ultimately the Supreme Court on some of these issues that have emerged. But as of today, those probationary staff have been reinstated, and they should be back on the job. But we know that there's going to be cuts throughout NIH, FDA, really every sector of the federal government. And we can look at previous budgets proposed by the Trump administration in the first iteration of the Trump administration. I'll just remind you that the president at one time had proposed a $6 billion cut to the NIH back in 2017. Now, interestingly, none of that was implemented because the Congress weighed in and rejected those cuts and actually increased funding that year for NIH by $3 billion. And funding went up for FDA as well. So it remains to be seen how the courts will rule.
All right, we apologize for that little technical glitch. We're back better than ever, new and improved. I want to remind people that we have that polling question out there. We're going to close that in a few minutes. I don't want to lead the results, but a significant number of you suggest you have been impacted already by these federal healthcare budget cuts. So we'll talk more about that. Patrick, you want to carry on? You're wrapping up your overview, and then we're going to go into our four main topic areas.
Yeah. Sorry for the technical glitch there. So a couple of other agencies that we're watching, most of the players are in place, but CDC director was just nominated, Dr. Susan Menares. She had been the number 2 person at ARPA-H during the Biden administration, so she's a known commodity. I'd met with her before, super nice and very knowledgeable. Dr. Oz is likely to be confirmed as the administrator for CMS. And then Dr. Thomas Engels is the head of HRSA, the Health Resources and Services Administration, if anyone's engaged with them. He was the previous administrator during the previous Trump administration. So he's a known commodity too. So we talked about changing faces. I just want to talk for a minute about changing ideology. Yes, elections have impact and repercussions, and there are a lot of new ideas coming into DC. And so, as people are trying to ferret out what this all means, I would really encourage people to look and read Project 2025. It's about 1,000 pages. You don't have to read the whole thing. I would read the sections that maybe relate to Health and Human Services, Veterans Affairs, and Department of Defense. There's a lot of insights in there about, really the blueprint, the game plan of where things are headed. Just a couple of basics on what's in there related to clinical research is that, there's definitely going to be a restructuring of federal health agencies. We haven't yet seen the totality of what that's going to mean. But we have some ideas. You can look at the previous Trump administration. They suggested moving AHRQ, the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, over within NIH. That's very possible. But I think we're going to see some adjustments in staffing, certainly at NIH and FDA, possibly to the tune of, 20%. But Congress is going to have to be involved in that dialogue as well. I think the courts are going to basically tell the administration that they don't have the authority that they think they do, and that Congress will need to be engaged. So the other thing we're going to see is limited regulatory authority. So we've already seen one of the executive orders is that there can only be one new regulation for every 10 regulations that are eliminated. So now that's going to be difficult because regulations correspond with laws. So unless you eliminate the laws, it's hard to eliminate the regulations. But we are going to see streamlining of the drug approval process, I believe. We're going to see it affecting, clinical trial standards, perhaps, review timelines, post-market surveillance. We're also going to see a revisiting of scientific priorities. We're already seeing that. Efforts to depoliticize science. And so we're seeing that in areas of reproductive health, transgender health, and other politically sensitive areas. We're also seeing, this movement away from some traditional research areas like oncology. Just recently, we saw huge cuts at Department of Defense, about $1.5 billion, related to cancer research. I don't think that that's going to stand. I think there'll be a review of that. The Congress will weigh in. A lot of those are focused around the country in facilities, as you know, that are spread out throughout the United States and have their own political constituencies. So it'll be interesting to see as individuals engage, as we start seeing these cuts and we start seeing those institutions and communities engage, how members of Congress react to this. And we're already seeing it. The phones are ringing off the hook up on Capitol Hill, and it's playing out. It's not playing out maybe before the television screens, but it's playing out behind the scenes. Legislators, both Democrats and Republicans, are on the phone to the White House. They're on the phone to the DOJ. They're on the phone to HHS, weighing in, expressing concern in some areas. So let me talk just for really briefly about implementation of these changing ideologies. So how does that get done? Well, typically it gets done through passage of laws. The administration works with the House and the Senate to restructure statutes that impact authority to spend money, as well as the actual dollar amounts they're able to spend. That's not happening just yet. And that's because the White House doesn't have a Congress that it can really work with. The margins in the House and the Senate are so very small, 1, 2 seats, 3 seats, that it's very difficult to get anything passed in Congress, because it really has to be bipartisan. So I think what you're seeing with the executive orders and Trump doing, news of the day, issuing an executive order almost every day in multiple areas. Although I would say on the healthcare side, they've sort of died down, and you may have noticed that there haven't been as many focused on healthcare. A lot of them are focused on things that impact healthcare, like trade and other areas. But the way to look at the executive orders is that they're temporary. They only really relate to that presidency. The next president comes in, let's say it's a different party, can completely rescind all of those executive orders and start anew. So it's not the best way to impact policy. The best way to impact policy is by changing laws and changing regulations. So, but this gives sort of the marching orders to the cabinet officials to move forward in a particular direction on, like, for example, the DEA executive orders that you saw, and now we're seeing the agencies and the DOJ go through and sort of address funding areas that impact DEI, excuse me. But again, executive orders are limited. Many of them are doing nothing. They're statements, but they're not really impacting change. And the ones that are truly impacting funding, and I think you have to watch and see what the courts do with those. So I'll stop there, and maybe we can address some of the question areas.
Yeah, no, excellent overview. Thank you. And Jim, I'm going to pull you in on this too, because our polling question, I think we're going to close it momentarily, but the results have been holding. The question was, has your company been impacted by federal healthcare cuts? And 42% of our attendees are saying yes. 34% say they don't know. It's up in the air. 24% say no. But Jim, I'm curious what you think. 42% saying yes, does that number surprise you?
Yeah, actually, it does. I wish I knew exactly who was in the audience. Unfortunately, we don't. But it seems to me where the greatest impact is going to be would obviously be with organizations that are working with NIH grants, since those have been cut pretty significantly. I don't know how much of that spills over into the type of networks that we represent, or the organizations that are the wholly owned investigator sites. I could be wrong, but I believe most of their business comes from big pharma and biotech and things of that nature, as opposed to the government. I think it's interesting, though, because, since NIH does so much of the early on research in terms of looking at mechanisms of action and, the early bench type of activities and testing hypotheses and things, I just am curious on how that's going to impact, development of new therapies downstream. I think the long-term impact is going to be more significant than the short term, and it worries me a bit, quite frankly. But Patrick, I would defer to you on that, because it seems to me that, again, a lot of the cuts that are taking place are in research that then lead to, knowledge that is shared with pharma and with biotech and other organizations that then bring those products, develop them, and bring them to market. What's your take on that?
Yeah, well, as we look at the potential pipeline of funding going forward, a couple things I would say. One, we just went through an effort in Congress to pass what we call a continuing resolution that funds the government for the remainder of this fiscal year. There's some good news in that. Total funding for NIH for fiscal year 25 is $48 billion. That funding is sustained from fiscal year 24. So that was what it was funded at fiscal year 24. So it basically means we're just moving forward that funding for the rest of 2025. So no dramatic cuts. There was a little bit of cutting in some 21st century cures areas at NIH, but nothing significant.
But correct me if I'm wrong, just because the budget's there doesn't mean that the spending will take place, right?
Exactly right. Exactly right. But it is an indication from Congress that they're expecting that money is spent. Now, there's a whole debate going on about whether the administration has the authority to impound funding or whether they have to spend it. That I think we're going to take to the Supreme Court. I think that case is going to move forward as we continue having these battles over spending in certain areas. But I don't believe that this administration it's their intent to not spend any of the money. I really think we are going to see continued significant spending on clinical research. I think there are some ideological changes that are going to pull money out of certain areas, but I'm guessing that money is going to be then refocused in other areas. And so I think part of the trick here is identifying where those new areas are going to be and being engaged with the agency, as well as being engaged with your elected officials in the Congress to talk to them if you're one of those entities that's been cut or that's experienced a cut, to talk to them about the benefits of that research that was cut. Oftentimes, we're seeing members of Congress reach out to the White House, reach out to NIH or other agencies and say, hey, this is why that funding was important. And we're seeing that funding reinstated. So advocacy in that way on behalf of your client, your organization, can really have an impact. So if you've been cut, I would say don't take it at face value. Engage with the agency, engage with your elected officials, and try to see if that funding can be reinstated. Because the money's there, and that's the good news.
Yeah, Michael, I don't know if you can see, but I'd be curious from the audience, those that have been affected, in what way were they affected? How
we
is
didn't
this?
ask that in the polling. Yeah, we didn't get that specific, but I would absolutely invite people, in an anonymous way, in a very discreet way, if they want to chime in with how they have been affected. That's a great idea, Jim. Hopefully, we'll get some people. We've got a few questions in the queue, which we'll get to in a second. But our first big agenda item, we've been touching on this already, is essentially what will the federal government fund? I don't know if we want to drill down a little bit more with that, or if we move on to the next area. You've touched on that, both of you already, a little bit. Patrick, did you want to go more into that a little bit?
Yeah, a little bit more. So fiscal year 25, I think, is baked, right? So that money is in the pipeline. Hopefully it'll be spent. Everyone should be encouraging the agencies to spend that money. Fiscal year 26 is a big question mark. So that's the next thing that Congress is going to work on. And this is where you've probably seen in the news, they've been talking about a budget resolution and budget reconciliation. Without boring you to tears, I will explain really briefly that budget reconciliation is a way that the Congress can move forward on the budget with a simple majority of votes. So in the Senate, 51, that's all they need. Most legislation to get finished needs 60 votes in the Senate. And that's because of filibuster rules. And that is why those are the checks and balances that are in place to try to get legislators to work together from both sides, from both House and Senate, and Democrats and Republicans. The one way to get around that is really budget reconciliation. And the only time that happens is if you're dealing with tax reform or if you're dealing with entitlement reform, large budget issues. So that's what's coming, is a debate on tax policy, a debate on large mandatory spending for Medicare, Medicaid, and the overall budget. And I think that is where I would encourage organizations to put a lot of their time and emphasis, because that is where we're going to see some of these budget cuts. Now, interestingly, if you look at the previous administration in 2017, when Trump first took the presidency, the budget for NIH was $37 billion. Today, it's $48 billion. So if they're talking about a $6 billion cut, which is what they had proposed previously, that doesn't even take us back to pre-2018 levels. Hopefully, we're not going to see that level of a cut, but I think the only way we're not going to see a level of that cut, and again, remember, Trump proposed that cut in 2017, and the Congress said, no, we're not going to do that. So the only way that happens is through aggressive advocacy. And so I would encourage organizations, who rely on NIH or really federal funding in any other area, to be very aggressively engaged with your congressional delegation. You've got to explain how this funding assists your community, assists the patients in your state, assists the health professionals, and be a real advocate for the resources and highlight all the good that's being done by the research that you're doing.
Hey, Patrick, let me jump in and ask. We got a question, and this is a good, basic, granular question. How do you lobby, like our MCR members or others in this industry, especially if you don't have much of a budget for it? I mean, what are some tactical ways voice be heard?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say, you don't need a lobbyist. I mean, it's great if you have one, but you, as an individual citizen, and I'm happy to help anyone with this, as an individual citizen, there's a way for you to get to your elected officials. Their contact information is online. They have offices in your backyard. They have offices in DC, but you don't have to come to DC. You can meet with them in your congressional district. So I would seek them out and seek out their staff. You're rarely going to meet with the member of Congress, but hopefully you will. And I encourage you to try to develop those relationships. But you want to meet with staff who are dealing with the healthcare issues for that particular member, and really just tell your story. It's all about sitting down, having a cup of coffee, and telling your story about the impact that this federal funding actually has in your backyard. Because I think a lot of legislators, a lot of these efforts with reducing funding are well-intentioned, right? Fraud and abuse, yeah, we all hate it, but there's a lot of good that's going on, and it's important for organizations to be stepping up and really voicing with legislators and with regulators, what that good is, and hopefully they'll be able to help you out and sustain that funding. And so I would encourage everyone. You certainly don't need a lobbyist. You can do this as an individual company or a citizen and reach out to your elected officials. And I'm happy to help anybody with that.
We'll be mindful of the time. We've got about 30 minutes left, and we encourage people to chime in with questions and also ways you've been impacted by these budget cuts or are concerned about it. Again, we'll keep it anonymous. But our next area we want to talk about, and this is a huge area for this industry, is vaccine research. I don't know, Patrick, if you and Jim want to weigh in on sort of the landscape there. I mean, obviously, that's a big issue with Kennedy at HHS.
Yeah, I can certainly start out. I mean, this is one of the areas where we've seen some cuts. There've been, my list says there's about 40 grants that have already been terminated relating to addressing understanding of vaccine hesitancy and strategies to improve vaccine uptake. It is interesting, the new NIH director testified on this, that he was supportive of the vaccines, but felt that more research was necessary. And so that's a slightly different take from maybe where Secretary Kennedy, his stated positions on vaccines. It is interesting. There's a whole dialogue going right now about bird flu vaccines, and it'll be interesting to see sort of where that moves to. But I think the other area is, some resistance to mRNA vaccine research. Probably not a surprise. And I don't know if that's a temporary issue, but I think there again, I think is an area where there's an opportunity for education, to educate public officials on what's really happening with that type of mRNA research. And
Jim, I'd love to get Jim in on this too. Jim, do you see, from your perspective, Kennedy's views on vaccines, is that going to could that have a chilling effect on vaccine research in the industry?
Well, yeah, I think so. And, part of it is that one of the things I'm concerned about is I know that our members do a lot of vaccine studies with, large patient populations, utilizing a number of sites. I did see recently that there's going to be a study they want to look back and see if there's a link between autism and vaccinations. I don't know if they're planning on doing that prospectively or retrospectively, but overall, this hesitancy does concern me. I would like to point out that, our organization is there to help educate not only other players in the industry, but regulatory as well as political figures. So, working with Patrick, we're not going to be quote unquote lobbying, but we will be out there advocating and educating what it is that's important to us and what we think is important ultimately to patients and clinicians. So things like this, where we have people challenging pretty well-established science, that's an area where I really think we need to have a voice, among others. Like Patrick said, it'll be interesting to see kind of where things go when the new budget comes forward, in the third or fourth quarter of this year. But in the meanwhile, looking at some of these executive orders, I think we need to be able to respond to those too, and again, educate our public figures on what we believe to be the correct approach to healthcare in the country.
Well, to Patrick's point earlier, a lot of these legislators, and politics aside, assuming most of them mean well, they're not very well versed in a lot of these subject matter areas. You can't be an expert in everything, and
Right.
people on this call know this industry really well. A lot of these legislators don't very much, and they are reliant to some degree on being educated by people who are in the field, such as our members. Patrick, did you want to talk more about vaccines, or we want to talk about NIH and FDA HHS cuts, how those could impact things?
Yeah, happy to talk about the cuts. As I mentioned earlier, what we've seen so far is mostly probationary staff, people who have been on staff for less than a year. I know of several people who have actually been at the agencies much longer and been promoted, but that promotion kicks in that 1 year, probation. So people who are very senior are being kicked out as well. Now, we've seen the courts weigh in already, put a stay in place, which requires the agencies to reinstate those people. I hope that process is happening. But my guess too is that, and I think this is tactically sort of what the Trump administration is doing as well, is they're not expecting all those people to come back. People are, if they think they're not wanted, they're going to move on, and so I think agencies will lose some talented staff. But I think it's also, as I mentioned at the outset, this is all about change. I think it's reasonable to suggest that there's possibly some overpopulation of staffing in the federal government. And I think it's reasonable to take a hard look at what's the appropriate staffing needs. I think no one likes to see these across the board cuts where, people have a job one day and not a job the next. But I think that will work itself out. Federal employees have a lot of protections under the law. And so the courts will do their work there. But I do think it sets up a bigger discussion of what's the budget going to look like, what's staffing going to look like at the various federal agencies. And that is where I think over the next, really over the course of this year, but even over the next 6 months, there's going to be a lot of activity focused on that.
Patrick, a question for you, because I look at this and I think, boy, the one thing that is good about a government job historically is it's very stable, right? And what's happening now is instability is being introduced. I wonder what your perspective is on the morale of the people who are currently there. If you get let go and then someone says, "Oh no, I made a mistake. Come on back." I mean, how are you going to feel about that? And how are your colleagues going to feel about that? And then that gets into, do you think that the organizations will operate as efficiently going forward due to lack of a morale or people's concern or even loss of talent? Do you think people are going to bail and go somewhere else because they feel unstable? I'm curious what your thoughts are there.
Well, Jim, let me add a caveat to that because we had a question come in. Somebody's asking, with staffing reductions already happening at FDA and NIH, et cetera, what are the realistic impacts on regulatory review timelines and site level operations? So I'd love to work in impact into this discussion too, potential impact.
Yeah, I think it all comes down to leadership of those various agencies. I think it is the mission or the job of the new NIH director to hopefully chart a course for NIH staff to encourage them to stay. So it'll be interesting to see what moves those the new NIH director and the FDA commissioner make to try to do that. But I think largely right now they're still in that phase of trying to restructure the agencies or figure out what they want the structure to look like. So I think for the time being, it's going to be a tense next 6 months of what this looks like. And I think you're right. Morale certainly suffers, and people question whether to stay in the federal government. I know a lot of people are looking. I've heard from a lot of them, sadly. But again, what is the right size? I think that they'll figure that out, working with Congress. But I think to your question, Michael, about what's the regulatory implications of this. When there were those initial cuts, particularly on some of the areas related to drug approval and device approval, the industry spoke up and said, "Hey, we're paying the fees that pay these salaries. These are user fees from PDUFA and MDUFA." And interestingly, HHS reinstated those people rather quickly. So there is a good dialogue. There needs to be a good dialogue between industry, and this is where AMRC can play a role too, is having that dialogue with the agencies, with the Congress, to say, hey, here's some of the unintended consequences of what you're doing. And that, at least in this one instance, worked. Now we'll see what the future cuts look like. But I do think regulatory output is going to slow down. But if you listen to the stated goals of the administration, I think they're trying to also address regulations so that these things can be sped up, so more products can get to the market quicker. So that's the other thing I would just encourage everyone on the call to think about is, are there regulatory changes that would help you in the areas that you're in? And maybe think about regulatory changes that the Trump administration could put in place that would be beneficial to moving things faster, but safely, but moving them faster through the approval process, and things that would help in the areas of clinical research. And I think the administration is going to have an open ear to regulatory simplification.
Well, we also got another question coming in on that. It's a person, a historical perspective. They asked, with regards to government-backed vaccine trials being canceled, is there a precedent for anything like this before in the U.S.? And if so, how was it handled? I mean, have we had a situation comparable like back on vaccine and research?
That's a good question. I certainly don't remember any large-scale rescissions like this, or terminations of grants just across the board. I mean, I think this is unprecedented, what we're seeing as far as terminations. We have seen Congress either make cuts to NIH or provide additional funding to NIH that then has had an impact. But no, I think this is I would say this: since the administration can't really get its agenda through the Congress, it's trying to do it administratively. So they're going to throw as much against the wall as possible and see what sticks, what the courts will allow them to do and what the courts won't allow them to do, and hope that they can achieve some budget savings in that way. And I think that's just part of the strategy. And I think it really is because they can't really move their legislative agenda in the Congress presently.
So
Jim,
Patrick,
did you want to add something? I think I interrupted you. Sorry.
yeah, no, that's okay, Michael. Earlier, Patrick, you mentioned something about a focus on streamlining the approval process. Has any work been done on that? And if so, what's the discussion around that?
So you may recall the legislation from a few years back, the 21st Century Cures legislation, legislation largely championed by Congresswoman Diana DeGette of Colorado, Democrat, and Congressman Larry Bouchon, Republican from Indiana. Larry Bouchon has retired, but the sort of the effort moves forward on Cures 2.0. And so I do think Congress is likely to continue looking at how do we get devices and drugs move through the process as quickly as possible to the patient. And I would look towards the House and the Senate, particularly the House Energy and Commerce Committee, to be doing some work in those areas. But the agency does have some regulatory discretion as well. So be it FDA can look at their own regulations under the existing law, and we may see them, make some. I would assume we're going to see them make modifications, and so it's a good time, I think, to be talking. If you see a need or something that would allow for quicker consideration of drugs and devices and quicker access to clinical trials, I think it's a good time to be talking with the agencies and with Capitol Hill on those.
That seems to me as an area where we could certainly add some value, because one of the biggest holdup in getting new products to market, obviously, is getting the trials completed, and that's exactly where our members offer an advantage. So that's an area where I think we could do some educating and advocating.
We're all about streamlining.
Absolutely.
Let's go into our final agenda item. We've got some time for discussion. And again, I encourage people, we have a few other questions in the queue we'll get to, but we encourage people to add their questions or just what they're seeing out there, areas you're concerned about, or priorities, or just what you've observed. We'd love to hear from you on this webinar. But the final area we were going to go into is talking about which research areas are most at risk. And I think, Patrick, you were going to talk about that for a minute. Maybe Jim would join in.
Yeah, and so these aren't going to shock you. I mean, I'm certain some of the areas you're seeing as well. I'm a little surprised by the significant reductions right out of the gate on cancer research. And I don't see I don't see Congress going along with that. So I think there will be pushback on reductions in spending on cancer research. Obviously, COVID, anything related to COVID and is a target right now. Infectious disease, we've seen significant funding suspensions in those areas, freezes. DEI initiatives sort of goes without saying. That's been a target area. It's been a target area for workforce initiatives, but now I think we're starting to see targeting equity funding. I just saw some funding that was rescinded relating to maternal health of African American women, and that's surprising, just given the challenges that exist in that community for maternal health and maternal mortality. Again, I don't see these going away permanently. I think this is an effort to redirect funding, redirect spending I'm hoping that by engagement with the agency and by engagement with members of Congress, these meaningful research in these areas can come back. But the other two areas that I would just mention are, well, one area in particular is rare disease. I think rare genetic disorders is another area where we're talking about these small populations, and I think without aggressive advocacy for those rare diseases, I think that's another potential area that will see some funding cuts.
Let's talk about DEI. That's such a huge issue, and obviously it doesn't appear to be. It's sort of the opposite of a priority for the Trump administration. This is maybe a tough question to address, but do either of you see that as having an impact on DEI efforts in the clinical trial industry? I mean, the science is so clear that diversity is key in so many patient populations, beneficial to the workforce as well. But do you think there's going to be a cause and effect here on how the Trump administration has been pulling back on DEI initiatives, how that may impact the industry?
It's interesting, Michael. I literally today got the IQVIA 2025 report regarding clinical research, and one of the things that struck me was compared to the population that we're actually doing quite well with African Americans now. Where we have a deficit is with Hispanic populations. My personal opinion is I think the scientists involved in doing clinical research and looking for data are going to want to have diverse populations, whether that be by race, gender, culture, whatever. The more data we have from a broader population, depending on the disease, of course, is going to be important from a scientific perspective. So my hopes are that the DEI type of initiatives we're seeing coming out of the current administration are not really going to translate into science. They may be social issues, but I'm hoping they won't become scientific issues. And from what Patrick was saying regarding this whole idea of trying to depoliticize science, that gives me hope. Patrick, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's a time to really lean in and discuss the importance of a diverse clinical research population. We know that there have been challenges, as Jim was saying, in creating that environment. And it is interesting to me, when you talk about DEI, I think it means different things to different people. Like some folks are thinking about it just with respect to employment and, where opportunities exist for employment, like, because some of the executive orders have been focused on federal workforce and eliminating DEI in determining who's in the workforce. But I think where it gets really particularly concerning to me is when some people are talking about not addressing inequities in care. And I think that's where it's important for the community, the healthcare community, to really weigh in and talk about the importance of data and research. And that's where I think facts really matter. And I think the industry can really shine a light on the importance of these drugs and devices, but the impact that they have on varying populations. And so that's a good dialogue to have. I think there are plenty of members of Congress who are willing to support that. But I think there needs to be a louder discussion about equity.
Interesting. We're getting close to the end. We've got a few more minutes, and we'd love to take any more questions if they come in. We've got a few here. Here's a good one to come in. Maybe if we wrap this up the next few minutes, it's a nice way to end on a positive note. Someone's asking, will any areas of research benefit from the Trump administration's agenda?
Oh, I do think so. I mean, I don't think we have a clear idea yet of exactly what those areas are, but we know chronic disease is an area that both Secretary Kennedy has talked about a lot. Certainly, the FDA commissioner, the new FDA commissioner, Dr. Mackey has talked about. So anything related to chronic disease. But I think we're going to see more details come out in the coming months of what this budget's going to look like. And we're going to see a clear direction on where some of the spending is going to happen. The spending is not going away in large part. Yes, there will be cuts in certain areas, but we're not going to see the government fade away here. But what's critical is staying involved and really helping these congressional offices and committees and the administration really focus their efforts in the right areas. And I think that's why I'm so glad AMRC was formed. I think you're in a unique environment to really have great input into what's going on at NIH, FDA, and on the Hill on these issues. And so I would say, really lean forward at this time of change, because I think everyone is trying to really improve the health of our citizens. Yes, the ideologies are changing. We have to address those, but I think there's real opportunity here as well. Challenges for sure, but opportunity absolutely.
Fantastic. I want to thank you both. This has been such a great session. I think we're going to wrap it up. We've addressed the question, and I'll take a final look at the polling, but just to give some idea on that one. Has your company been impacted by the federal healthcare budget cuts? The final response, we have 41% said yes, 35% said don't know, and 23% said no. So we'd love to do some follow-up on that. We'd love to hear from attendees on future topics you'd like us to cover in webinars or in anything else. We're here for you, and we want to help you navigate these difficult times. I want to thank Patrick and Jim for helping us remove some of the mist from the crystal ball. These are interesting times, and we benefited a lot from both of you today giving us input. I want to thank you all very much. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, everybody. Patrick, special thank yous to you. Appreciate it.
Appreciate it. No, this is fun. Thanks.